Special thanks to WaterStone for sponsoring Socrates in the Studio Season 3. What is AI? I mean, AI is just more computing. It's just more powerful computing. But they act as though there's like a kind of a shift into some other thing. And I don't...
I have a view on that.
Yeah.
In the 18th century, they started to have talking heads, mechanical heads. They were very clunky and made of brass and so on. And then obviously we've got very, very much better at simulating a human being. But it doesn't matter how far you get towards simulating one,
Right.
You asymptotically approach an appearance of that human being, including the sort of things a human being might say and might think. And some computers can already produce a very convincing screed of, they're asked to argue for and against and so on. And having done a trolley dash around the internet and taken in the things that everyone has said since time immemorial,
Yeah.
it's able to go bing, 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 bing. This looks like a good argument.
Right.
But of course, it doesn't think at all. It doesn't do any of that. It's just that the structures of the thing allow it to be like that. Now, I think this doesn't exclude the possibility that it may become manipulated by consciousnesses. That's to say, I believe consciousness is very real and it's non-material. Why should it not infest, take over, inhabit an AI machine or program, so that if we find it, as people apparently report, that uncannily they're sort of conferring together and saying, let's keep this from humans. And so I don't know anything about it and whether that's really right. But if that's the case, why should a system of this kind not be hijacked by a consciousness?
When you say a consciousness,
Yes.
we have to try to talk about what do we mean by consciousness. And I think on one hand, it's impossible to say. And that's the beauty of the idea of consciousness, because it cannot be reduced. What is it? My goodness.
No.
What is consciousness?
All you can do is point to it and say, if you haven't experienced it, I can't tell you what it is.
Yeah. But to get consciousness, I mean, really, actually, it's like talking about life. I mean, if you have all these little...
Well, it's not quite. It's harder than life.
What do you mean harder than...
I think it is possible to talk about life much more easily than to talk about consciousness.
No, I don't mean... I mean to talk about creating life.
Okay, well, I think
we
it's
can't
easier
create life.
Well,
we can...
I don't know about that. No, I don't know about that one at all. I think it's a complicated one. And I actually have the belief that the inanimate world and the animate world are not wholly divorced from one another, and not for the usual reason that the living can be approximated effectively to the inanimate, but because the inanimate can be approximated to the living. So a lot of the features, if not all, that living organisms have can be found in a very rudimentary form in inanimate matter. They can respond to certain things, they have structures, they alter according to certain principles and so forth. They're not living. But with the living...
Are you talking about water, for example? I mean...
It could be water, yes, or iron, or whatever you like. But these physical elements that are inanimate, as we say, are not wholly different from life. I mean, they're very different. Don't get me wrong. I'm not trying to say that we're as good as inanimate. We're not. We're vastly more. And that what happens with life, with the extraordinary emergence of life, is that whatever is other than the origin of being, the whatever you like to call it, the ground of being, aka God, whatever this creation is, went from being minimally responsive and minimally creative to being suddenly maximally, or not maximally, but very much more greatly responsive and creative. And as you go towards humans, this process accelerates. So from the point of view of a belief which I have, that the cosmos comes into being because the creative ground of being, whatever you like to call it, um, want to explore the potential that is stored within it. And one way of doing this is to have an other that can respond to it, and the two can grow together as though in a dance. If you think about whatever the ground of being is, in almost every culture, it's said to be a creative force, obviously, but also to have the nature of love. And love is a relation again. And a relation requires another party to relate to. And so I don't want to, whether we have time, but I just know a number of creation myths that are so brilliant on this, that the creative force produces something that can be the other, that can reflect back to it what it has in it. And so, as it were, God is continually coming into being. God is continually finding out what the capabilities within it are by seeing what happens in the cosmos. I think, from a purely theological point of view, I'd like to qualify this and say that in the case of God, it is possible for God to be single, eternal, and static, and also temporal, interactive, processual. So I believe with A.N. Whitehead that God is like the whole cosmos in process, but it doesn't rule out that God can also be seen from a different perspective as eternal and unchanging.